wanted to do a quick video on something that I see in a lot of videos online when people plant trees or not shrubs, but trees or conifers that are larger typically, that are planted, and there's no discussion about where the root flare on a tree is or where the grafting point on a tree is, which both should not be buried under the ground. And when you buy things at a nursery in a pot or in a ball and burlap, quite often I have found that the root flare is definitely buried, and sometimes even the grafting point is buried. This is a Kurenai-jishi Japanese maple. It's kind of hard to see here. It's called a red lion's head because in the spring it's red. It has these really cool tufted leaves on it that turn to a coppery color and then green later in the summer. But it's an Acer palmatum Japanese maple, and Japanese maples, for the most part, are all grafted onto a rootstock. So it's an Acer palmatum rootstock, which is down here, and then you can see there's a point where the bark changes right here, and that's the grafting point. So they take a scion, which is just more or less a branch from an actual Kurenai-jishi Japanese maple. So they would like cut off this little branch, and then they would come to an Acer palmatum species tree that's a rootstock, and they would cut it right in, the branch right in, right here. And then after a little while, when it gets growing, they would cut off the original Acer palmatum tree, and then you just have the Kurenai-jishi growing on a different rootstock. That's a better rooting tree. That's the whole idea behind it. The Acer palmatum species is a very strong rooting tree. So something like the Kurenai-jishi itself, which was a sport off another tree, doesn't really root that well and have really good root strength. So you put it on a species tree that can really support the growth of the new tree that you put on it. So most Japanese maples are put on Acer palmatum species seedling trees that are grown just for that purpose. But what I wanted to talk about is what I'm seeing a lot of is both the grafting point and the root flare at the bottom of the tree are buried by 1 or 2 or 6 inches below the clay from a ball and burlap tree, or even in a pot. So in this one, here's the grafting point. I don't know if you can clearly see it, but here's the root flare. So this always has to be above the ground when you plant it. If you don't plant the root flare above the ground, what happens is over several years, the tree's own roots can choke the tree out by wrapping around it, or the bark from the tree will actually rot over time being underground, and then the tree will die from that. It'll girdle itself basically by the bark rotting off the tree, and you won't even know why. 10 years later, all of a sudden your tree died. So that's the biggest reason to do it. You have to do it. So some people will say just plant trees high when you plant them, which is a good idea because you don't want the tree to be planted too low. But I haven't seen in any video where anybody actually discusses when you get a plant and you go to put it in the ground, the first thing you have to do before you even go to put it in the ground is dig down in the pot and find where, if you have a grafting point, like on something like Japanese maples or fruit trees, things like that, which all have grafting points, that's above the ground. But also dig down till you get to the root flare. And when you plant the tree, the root flare has to be above the ground. So this is a good example. On this one, it was a couple of inches. It was a couple of inches below the ground. And the reason I'm talking about this is because in the last week, we've planted, I don't know, 3 or 4 different larger, small trees, but trees that are 4, 5, 6 feet tall, and a conifer that was 8 feet tall, where the root flare was significantly below the surface of the way it was shown in a pot or a ball and burlap. And if you just put it into the ground at the level of the ball and burlap or the level of the tree in the pot, it would be planted too deep. So a good example of this is we have a flamethrower redbud, which is kind of a semi-weeping redbud that came out a few years ago. So this one we got in a pot, and this one, when we got it, if you can see how crooked the bottom of the tree is? Well, there's a reason it's that way, because it was a crooked graft that they did. Like here is the grafting point on it right here, right? But the root flare is right here. So what I did is, you know, it was probably a 5-gallon pot that it came in, and the dirt line was up here above the grafting point. So I was digging down to the point where I was thinking, I must be crazy that it could possibly be a root flare that far down. But the root flare was this far down. It's about 8 inches below where the dirt line was in the pot. So if you planted this, you would plant it 8 inches above where the graft was, and you would bury the graft where the root flare was, and you would bury the graft. And this tree wouldn't have a chance after several years. So another reason that it might have been that way in the pot is because they had such a crooked graft that they buried it. So when you go to buy it, like we did, and it wasn't a cheap tree, it was like a $250 tree, that it was something that would keep people from buying it if they saw that it was that way. And that was something we planted 3 years ago now. So we have one more that I wanted to show specifically. It's a styrax, which is a tree about the size of what a Coosa dogwood would be. Maybe, 10 to 15 feet high and 8 feet wide, 10 feet wide. It's a very dark color tree. It's called a styrax. It has, really dark covered leaves. It has berries, flowers that come out in the spring, white flowers over the dark leaves, which is impressive. And then it has white berries that come out after that. So we just put this in the ground this week. It's about 7 feet tall, and this came in a pot. And when I went to look for the root flare again, this one's pretty clear to see. So here's the trunk. It's got a pretty good sized trunk. And then at this point, here's the graft onto the rootstock right here. And you can clearly see by the color that the root flare was about 4 inches below the surface of the dirt, and even the graft was even below the dirt again. So I was digging down, and this whole 4-inch area was covered with fibrous roots. And I was thinking to myself, I must be wrong. Like, it can't be that deep with all these roots. But the roots had grown up into the potting medium and filled in that whole area with fibrous roots that had to be taken off, because you can't just shove them down into the dirt until I got to where the root flare was. And actually there was a root right here, a small root, that was actually girdling the plant and spinning around. So it's just something that I wanted to talk about, that sometimes people will say plant a tree high, and I don't know if it's just people's general knowledge of thinking, well, if you plant it high, it has less issues. And it might be because history tells them, well, if I plant it high, it has less of a chance of dying. And maybe that's because, it's mounded and this doesn't get soaking wet and it's able to hang on. But the right way to do it is to, and you can do this even when you're at the nursery, just poke around in the pot. It's harder on ball and burlap because they're clay, but in a nursery, you can poke around in the pot until you find the root flare and see if there's any deformity in the graft or the way the root flare is underneath it before you buy it. And you can even pop plants out of the pot when you're at a nursery. Just pull them out of the plastic pot and look and see how dense the roots are on the outside if it's been in the pot for several years and maybe doesn't look too healthy. But the biggest thing is when you get them home, either way, is to find where the graft is, if it's a plant, that a type of tree or conifer that's been grafted. I guess it would just be trees, not conifer so much. But and find that root flare before you plant it, and you'll save yourself a lot of problems. down the road. So just wanted to do a quick video on that, and hope you find that something that you can use.